Hi everyone, welcome. We're just going to let people roll into the room and we'll get started in a minute or so. But yeah, welcome. You get comfy and then we'll get going. Great, there's still a few more people joining, so I'll just give it give it a moment. Okay, bro. There's a few more people coming in. But yeah, as you come in, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from today. Last time we did the session, I forgot to turn the chat on when I said that. So for 10 minutes, people couldn't introduce themselves. So this time I have remembered to turn it on. So yeah, please do introduce yourselves. And yeah, we'll get going. We'll get going very, very soon. Okay, great. We'll just get started and we'll let more people come into the room as it's going. So just hi everyone and thanks for joining us for session two in our political education webinar series Visions for a Global Green New Deal. My name is Tyrone Scott and I'm the Senior Movement Building and Activism Officer at War on Want, and I'll be introducing today's session, and like I said, please do introduce yourselves in the chat as well. And just a bit about what this series is. Visions is about trying to imagine and organize for a better and more equitable world, and trying to build the knowledge, confidence, and collective power that we need to challenge injustice and hopefully shape a future rooted in solidarity, fairness, and the collective power of people. And throughout this series, we're unpacking the core tenets from War on Want's Global Green New Deal framework, which is due to be out soon, which ranges from public ownership and food sovereignty to economic transformation and a just and equitable transition. Each session will look to bring together voices from across the global north and south and hope they offer not just political education, but inspiration, solidarity, and some practical pathways for organizing and taking action. Each session is going to run on the fourth Wednesday of every month, except next month, which will actually be on the fourth Tuesday of June 24th, because I'm not going to be around on the Wednesday. And that'll take us all the way to COP30 in Belém in Brazil this November, which we know is crucial in the global fight for climate justice. And we're having these times at these conversations at a time of escalating climate breakdown, deepening inequality, quality, and genocidal violence, all fueled by our global reliance on fossil fuels and systems of oppression which enable these crises. And across the world, energy systems remain driven by extraction and corporate control, which keeping people half the world trapped in poverty while the wealthiest profit from this destruction. And that's why today's session is focused on energy justice and public ownership, on what it means to take back control of our energy systems and how we can secure clean, affordable energy for all communities. And today we're really excited to be joined by a fantastic panel of speakers. From War on Want, we have Seb Munoz and Ahmed Hafezi, who will share the slot. Then we have Lala Peñaranda, who will tell me I've definitely said that wrong, from the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, who are very lucky to be joining us from Bogotá in Colombia. Lazarus Tamana from the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, speaking on the legacy of fossil fuel extraction across the Niger Delta. And Chris Hayes from Commonwealth, bringing it back to what that means in the UK in our fight for energy democracy and public ownership. And then we'll hopefully have about half an hour left for a Q&A. So there's a Q&A function on Zoom. Please just put your questions in there as we go, and then we'll try and get through as many of them before we finish at 7:30. But before that, I'll stop speaking and I'll hand over to our first speaker, Seb from War on Want. Thanks.
Thanks, Ty. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you, thank you. Hi everyone. Really glad you're able to be here with us today. It's a sunny day here in the UK, and so a good time to be talking about the energy transition, the just transition, and what we can do. So Actually, today is taking place in the context of a global day of action against Glencore. So just wanted to start off with that because just this morning, Ty and I joined an action in the UK, which is actually being replicated across the world in South Africa, in Colombia. And for those of you who don't know, Glencore is sort of one of the world's biggest mining companies. It's also a commodities trader, and it's probably not as well known as Shell or BP, but it's just as destructive, just as reliant on exploitation, extraction, and a drainage of resources from the global south. And it was really relevant that the Glencore Day of Action took place today because it really reminds us that energy justice means standing with communities who are resisting exploitation and extraction, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Colombia, Argentina, Peru, and actually, very importantly, Palestine. Glencore's coal extraction in Colombia, which has been taking place for over 4 decades, and Glencore's been at the helm of that for the last 2 decades in a mine called the Cerrejón mine, doesn't just devastate indigenous and Afro-descendant communities and lands in La Guajira in the north of Colombia, it also fuels genocide because we found out shortly after the genocide began that Glencore was actually supplying Israel with coal and the resources directly tied to apartheid and war crimes in Gaza. And so these interconnected struggles highlight how current energy supply chains and strategies are fundamentally unjust, rooted in extraction, colonialism, and global inequality. As part of the Global Day of Action and the action in the UK, we visited the Apple store in Oxford Circus because we wanted to demonstrate how supply chains for so-called transition minerals and renewable energy infrastructure remain fundamentally reliant on extraction in the global south. So behind the sort of the buzzword and the appealing narrative of the green transition is a much more insidious agenda, a scramble for critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, that extends far beyond renewable energy alone. And these materials aren't used only in solar panels and wind turbines, but are also integral to advanced military technology, such as fighter jets, missiles, surveillance systems, and drones. So really, this rush for resources is a new phase of militarization, geopolitical conflict, and intensified violence. And it's propping up a vision of an economy that's built on extraction, colonialism, and war. And it reinforces exactly the global structures of power and exploitation that we need to dismantle instead of replicating. So, the current energy transition, as dictated by the global north and corporations, essentially deepens exploitation, inequality, and ecological harm. It betrays the true meaning of justice and equity. We say that a genuine transition has to center around sovereignty, reparations, global solidarity, and harmony with the earth. And at War on One, we've been working with our partners across the global south to think about what are some of the principles of energy justice. So fundamentally, the struggle is one about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and who decides. Energy has to be a public good, and we'll hear a lot about that today. It needs to be reclaimed from private profiteers and instead put under community and worker control. Much easier said than done, as we'll find out. It needs to be equitable and universally accessible. And as I've said, it needs to be harmonious with our ecosystems and our territories. For this, we absolutely need public ownership and democratic control of energy systems, and these are non-negotiable. So the energy future must be managed democratically to serve public needs, not private profits or geopolitical interests. And that's why we've been advocating for a public pathway for the UK critical mineral strategy that Ahmed will talk a little bit more about, which is about breaking free from exploitative supply chains and financial dependencies on the global north. So today we're getting a real complete picture of the energy system, what's wrong with it, what needs to change, what are the points of leverage. Our allies, our partners today will shed light on different parts of that global struggle. As I've mentioned, Ahmed will discuss critical minerals, sovereignty, and how we break from exploitative global financial systems as a condition to be able to advance a truly just transition. Then Lala is going to talk about the incredible work of trade unions for energy democracy and what they're doing to organize with trade unions right across the global south to build a true energy democracy from the ground up. Lazarus will share both the devastating impacts of fossil fuel extraction, the legacy of that in Nigeria's Niger Delta, but also centering how the need for accountability, for justice, for reparations for communities is also an integral part of the transition. And then Chris will bring it back into the debates and the struggles in the UK about particularly looking at the UK government's sort of Great British Energy Company and raise some really critical questions about how it can and should serve the public good or whether it's going to continue serving corporate interests. So, as a way of kind of framing the conversation we're about to have, it's important for us to listen, to learn, to exchange, but also to know that this is very much part of an ongoing political discussion about the transformation of our energy systems. It's about demanding genuine public control, equitable distribution, and global justice in energy. Today is a really, really interesting and fantastic opportunity to think about how that struggle and that vision for energy justice and energy democracy is going to play out. What does it mean to define the transition as truly democratic, for it to be community centered, for it to be ecologically sound and justice based? And so maybe I'll just end with a point about, where this is a critical year in terms of climate mobilizations and in terms of climate justice because we're on the road to COP30. And so the way in which we're able to mobilize around the type of energy transition that we want is essentially the same power that needs to be built that allows us to really shift things at the COP30 and in all the different multilateral spaces. It's about more than just influencing those negotiations because it's about building a critical block of organizations, movements, communities that are capable of shifting global power dynamics. And it's basically through exercises like this, through our mobilizing, through our building power, that we can elevate the power and the perspectives of the global South to challenge existing hierarchies and unlock the potential for true global cooperation, regional integration, and genuine sovereignty in harmony with the Earth. So I'm going to hand over to Ahmed, who's been leading One-on-One's work on the UK critical mineral strategy. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Seb. No, you put it perfectly there. That this is really the time to be talking about this. I mean, we've been needing to talk about this for quite a long time, but I mean, as I will mention, like this year in particular is when a lot of these issues are going to be spotlighted in both the UK and global forum. So I'm going to talk about, hopefully very quickly, a little bit about critical minerals in a little bit more depth. And so these minerals, they might sound arcane. Some of you may have heard of them, some of you may have not. But struggles around lithium, copper, cobalt, these kinds of metals actually touch on sort of many of the main big issues of our moment and our time. So what we're witnessing right now is this transition from the old fossil fuel order to what some people would call a metal era, fueled by multiple strategic materials. And really, there's three elements to this. One being sort of what we're talking about today, the decarbonization of our energy systems, where there are several key questions that need to be answered, such as who will benefit, who will lose out, and what will this new economy look like. The second, which Seb also touched on, are these geopolitical and economic trends towards fragmentation. So really responding to the rise of China, you have the ordering principles really being national security, what the EU calls strategic autonomy, militarization, and interstate competition. And then the third point I would say is you have a shift in growth models towards focusing on digital infrastructure. So artificial intelligence fueled by energy intensive data centers and also chips. And so all three of these aspects depend on minerals or metals. And these are the minerals that governments around the global north are labeling as critical, right? And when we see that term critical, we have to be critical ourselves and understand that it's not a neutral term. The question has to be critical for who benefits from the supposed urgent need for this demand. And most of these minerals are actually concentrated in the global south. And China, as I mentioned, dominates the supply chains of these minerals, particularly processing. So this is the background for the UK critical mineral strategy, which is sort of slow in the context of other global north governments. It is slow to be released in that it hasn't yet been released and it will be released later this year. And the central framings are following these trends that I'm laying out. So economic resilience, national security, competition, and even sort of striving towards energy dominance and this vision of the UK as a green energy export superpower. And that means, as you can expect, the real principles that we should be fighting for, justice, human need, and cooperation, are sort of much more to the side of the strategy. And what it means is differentiate from our perspective. I guess we would need to differentiate between what's referred to as transition minerals, so minerals needed for batteries, solar panels, and decarbonized energy systems. But from the perspective of the UK government, the other sources of mineral demand are equally, if not as more important. And these are demands coming from the tech and defense sectors in particular. So as I said, chips, data centers, and from the military perspective, reinforcing the idea of the UK's military industrial complex as what economists will call the source of our comparative advantage. So this is an area that the UK is competitive in globally, and the UK government is doubling down on the military sector as kind of a place where it will grab a greater share of global economic value. And so we need to recognize that as greenwashing. When we see critical minerals used interchangeably with what we really should be calling transition minerals. And so from the perspective of the Global South, there is a temptation, I guess, to see this as a repetition of history, where the Global South, for many years, through colonialism and into the independence years, has been treated as a reservoir of cheap raw materials by the Global North, locked at the bottom of the value chain, exporting raw materials and importing expensive, high value-added goods from the Global North. And this is sort of the longer and older story of trade justice struggles in the Global North and in the Global South, which really a large part of has always been fighting the externalization of costs of running the global economy onto the Global South. And so this is the story where at the level of governments in the Global South and states, they are trapped in these extractive dynamics where they're dependent on external debt and then dependent on extraction to service that external debt, which is denominated in foreign currencies that they don't issue. But it's also the local story that we would always tell and always stand in solidarity with of local communities that are affected by extraction. And so this, when seen from that perspective, the extraction of fossil fuel and the extraction of something like lithium or cobalt, there isn't a huge difference in a lot of these instances where you have widespread pollution, widespread disrespect for human rights, displacement of indigenous communities, but also the fact that these extractive operations, they don't create local jobs. The profits are often made by multinational corporations that then take them to tax havens. And obviously local elites as well who benefit from extraction are also likely to stash their money away in tax havens in the global north. Sorry, I'll try to speak a bit louder. And so, this context is still in place, as I mentioned, in this transition that we're experiencing. The difference we would argue and we would want to highlight is that the governments and movements in the Global South are not passive victims in any of this. So for better or worse, they are recognizing the leverage they hold and understanding themselves not as poor countries or poor people, but as rich in strategic materials. Sorry, you can hear me, right? Yeah. And the fact that these materials are concentrated in the Global South disproportionately gives these countries and movements unique bargaining power with the Global North. And so there are various examples maybe we can talk about later and I can reference to in terms of governments and movements putting forward alternatives. But from the UK side, as this mineral strategy is released in the coming weeks and months, we would argue that this strategy must support countries in the Global South to leverage this resource wealth, to build up their own industrial capacity, to capture a greater portion of the value. But from the perspective of local communities, respect for what is called free, prior, and informed consent, and the right for mining affected communities to reject new projects outright. These must be non-negotiable in agreements and partnerships. And then from the UK perspective of consumption, we need to foreground demand reduction as a way to respect ecological limits. So what this means is, for forecasts for mineral demand are like very variable depending on the specific economy that they're plugging into. And we have much evidence and hopefully more evidence to show that the justice-oriented approach, the public pathway approach, are also the least resource intensive. And so we want to demand UK government take this quite seriously, and making the argument firmly that structuring economies around need and profit and endless accumulation is also the justice solution from the perspective of global South sovereignty, but also for local communities affected by mining. Yeah, so our four main points that we really want to make is that these unjust trade rules, which I didn't go into, but limit policy space and reinforce this role that the Global South plays as a provider of cheap raw materials. This approach to trade agreements with the Global South cannot be replicated in the new mineral strategy. Secondly, we would demand an end to what is known as ISDS in existing agreements. So this is the investment rule that allows foreign corporations to sue governments in the Global South for basically doing policies that they disagree with. And so we might hear later on about the case of Glencore that Seb mentioned, which has used ISDS a number of times to attack local communities fighting back in Colombia and elsewhere in the world. And then the third point we want to make is that there needs to be an attempt to clearly differentiate between these transition minerals and minerals used in, for example, the tech and defense sectors. And number four, we need a concrete plan for demand reduction in the UK with a focus on investment in public transport in particular, but also the topic of this webinar being public energy systems that are better situated to promote energy efficiency and to holistically affect and implement a justice-based model that respects ecological limits. I'll leave it there and pass it on to the next speaker.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So my name is Lala Peñaranda. I'm the Latin America coordinator at Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, based in Bogotá, Colombia. And I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you for putting this event together. All right, so here we go. So TUED, I think offers or puts forward what we call a public pathway alternative, as Seb mentioned, to the topic of today's discussion, guaranteeing the right to clean, affordable energy. And just very quickly, a few words about TUED. It's a network of 130 unions in about 40 countries, primarily from the energy sector, but also education, healthcare, transport, retail, etc. With the idea being that all workers are affected and therefore by the just transition, by the climate crisis, and therefore all have stakes and a role to play in the creation of this global Green New Deal and a global just transition that is internationalist. And TUED has, for the past 3 years, focused primarily on the creation and development of TUED South, which is the platform of Global South trade unions within the network. So from Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and the Asia Pacific region. And it's really just been such a pleasure to work with Warren Want to help bring more movements and more trade unions into this work, into the fight for a just transition and the public pathway. And just before I go on, I think there's kind of two pillars, might be an oversimplification, but there's two main pillars of our work or of our analysis. The first is the defense of the public ownership of energy. And public ownership meaning definitely not just state ownership, because we know that state ownership alone can be extremely violent, repressive, exploitative, but really it can happen at all scales. When we talk about public ownership, this can include community ownership, municipal, or state. And that's the prerequisite for then the second pillar, which is the democratic control of this energy. So what does it mean, not just for workers to be at the forefront of fighting for this just transition and making decisions around just energy tariffs, around the decarbonization of our economies, around energy sovereignty and guaranteeing the right to energy access, but also the communities most affected and energy users as political subjects, and really politicizing and radicalizing energy as one of the metabolic elements of our economy, central to sustaining life. And so I think it's from that perspective that we talk about the public ownership of energy, and critically removing the profit imperative from the formula of costs and prices, which I'll get into in a second. So, I think just very briefly, the two-eyed analysis is essentially that we're seeing an energy expansion currently, not a transition. And this reflects the absolute failure of the green growth neoliberal approach to the energy transition. It is in deep crisis, and we, I think a reckoning that we are losing this fight currently, and we have to get really serious about building this alternative. And as we denominate it a public pathway alternative. And in the power sector, this means different things. And of course, each one of these could be a sort of a book in and of itself. But fundamentally, we're fighting in the power sector to fulfill the right to energy, which doesn't, of course, just mean like having a light bulb in your home, but really having equal access to the right to, for example, education through electricity, et cetera, to reverse neoliberal laws and directives affecting the power sector, to enforce a new pro-public mandate. I'll get into some of these terms in a second. Establish a public planned approach to the energy transition. So reclaiming the ability to not just react according to market forces and values, but really to plan ahead 10, 20, 30 years or more down the line, to introduce democratic governance and control of publicly owned companies and initiatives, to provide a high level of collective guarantees for workers, to publicly fund the energy transition, and in such a way, not just that, subsidizes private profit then, but really creates an ecosystem of publicly owned and quality public services. And then to establish, a global public goods framework for multilateral cooperation. And this is, despite the kind of horrors of these trade wars and the repercussions around the world for the working class, there is nevertheless an opening for us now, especially in the global South, to explore multilateral cooperation in new ways. So, I'm just going to get into a few of these, not all of them, but I want to land these concepts a little bit. So, the first one, when we talk about reversing neoliberal laws and directives affecting, in this case, the power sector, although this could also apply to other energy sectors, we're talking, about a few things. I'm going to highlight this third point: to end public subsidies that de-risk investment and thus guarantee profits for private interests. It seems that our entire energy system, in Colombia, in Brazil, and beyond, are really structured to de-risk investments. And there's, the idea that investments, especially in the global South, are riskier. There's this, perception. And so global South states, public purses have to double down, are forced, imposed often to double down, de-risking and guaranteeing profits for private multinational lenders or loaners, or energy companies. And so it's truly, genuinely one of the most inefficient systems that you could see, where at each step of the sort of cost formulation, you not only have to guarantee profit, but sort of artificially de-risk investments for companies that And these are funds that otherwise could much, in a much more efficient, rational, planned way, could guarantee, public funds for a public energy system. And in Colombia, this topic of kind of reversing neoliberal laws and directives affecting the power sector, just to land it somewhere and ground it, has focused on, for example, identifying laws 193 and 194 of the power sector, and really, these were laws that were created to prioritize, like elsewhere, profits for the private sector, to incentivize investments, etc., and to prioritize private sector participation in the power sector over any public planning and public ownership. And Petro has made just tariffs one of his main pillars. I think outside of Colombia, lots of people see the kind of climate agenda that Petro has positioned, but inside, really, actually, the fight for just tariffs has been just as or even more important and in the limelight. And one of the things that this has done is really politicize commissions like the CREG, the Commission of Regulation of Energy and Gas. And I think that the importance of this really can't be underestimated, to politicize, to put into the public discourse, to make the mainstream media report on why the Petro administration and others are fighting against the sort of neoliberal commissions and formulations of agencies across Colombia. Another point of the public pathway in the power sector that I want to just quickly touch on is this idea of enforcing a new pro-public mandate. So, again, in Colombia, maybe more than maybe anywhere else, we know that it's not enough to have public ownership. Ecopetrol, which is 88% state-owned, had board members that are directly responsible for paramilitary assassinations and disappearances of oil and gas unionized workers in Uso. Like, we know that these companies can be, again, just as repressive and exploitative socially and environmentally as private companies. And so that's why we say that the necessary, really, like when we talk about energy democracy, it's about fighting for a pro-public mandate, a mandate that the private sector does not have. But we know that it requires social movements, it requires workers' movements to really enforce this and make this a reality. So we talk about, for example, establishing clear requirements and guidelines for public power companies to drive the energy transition in ways that actually first identify for our countries, for our communities, and then meet those needs of people and protect the environment. To stop the further privatization of the power sector assets and services, even though Ecopetrol, just to give an example, continues to be, again, majority state-owned, there are people still put into the national board whose job it seems to be to create the conditions to privatize the company and, resulting in short-term gains for the few and long-term gains for losses for the many. So to reclaim power sector companies to public ownership, of course, that have been privatized, and to fully reintegrate or rebundle power generation, transmission, distribution, and grid management functions. In many countries around the world, it was, they didn't 100% privatize and power companies, but rather kind of cut the limbs of the most profitable parts, sort of sending the utility companies into a death spiral, as we call it. And I think, in the reclaim ownership where companies have been privatized, I'll just say that I think we have to be really creative with that point. In Colombia, the power generation company, Isagen, was privatized by Brookfield, the Canadian asset management company, and since then has basically when you look at how the budget has been distributed, it's reduced investment in the infrastructure of power generation in Colombia, and it's increased returns to investors through debt payments and other things. And it'll be very difficult to reclaim that company, which is, I think, a campaign worth fighting for in Colombia. But we also are looking for example for Ecopetrol which recently became an energy company, not just oil and gas, to be able to change Colombian laws for it to be able to generate and commercialize energy, and in this case, renewable energy. Ecopetrol actually just purchased a few wind plants in the north of the country. So, however we do this, we have to be creative, and those creative solutions never come in a one-size-fits-all. What works for Colombia will not work for Ecuador, will not work for South Africa, will not work for Indonesia. So it's really about people on the ground who know their country, who know their sector, who know the workforce, offering solutions that can make sense for achieving these goals that we want. And I'm just cognizant of time, but let me just actually jump to some examples of the Colombian movement. Sorry, one second. This is some of the public pathway sort of organizing work that we've done in the Asia Pacific region, and then in Africa as well. And I'm just trying to get to here we go. So in Latin America, we have a kind of situation where almost 80% of Latin America's 67 largest energy and electricity companies are privately owned, and only 13 companies remain under state control. So this is, it's an upward battle, and we really need all hands on deck, workers, social movements, progressive people and allies in government to really be creative and create sustained campaigns for how to reclaim and restore public power. Of these 67 largest energy and electricity companies in Latin America, approximately 40% are controlled by foreign companies. So this is just as much about reclaiming and restoring to public control as it is about also the very basic tenets of energy sovereignty in imperialist and neocolonial world. And so I want to essentially wrap up, and maybe we can get into other topics during the questions, but talk about the energy democracy movements in Colombia, and to really highlight, I think, why they are doing incredible work. And so, one of the movements is called MODEM, the National Movement for the Constituencies of Energy Democracy. And the premise is that in Colombia, we have kind of the workers in their trade unions, and we have the feminist movement, and we have campesinos fighting or farm workers fighting for agrarian reform. And it seems that there's different constituencies tied to different causes. But we know that the strength of our movements are in the interlinkages, one, and two, that energy democracy really doesn't have a political subject that is organized. And so the idea of this movement, which isn't the only one, but it's the one that I want to highlight here, MODEN, is to create a sort of coherent political subject around the energy user. And again, that doesn't mean that it's going to organize in an isolated way, the complete opposite, as I'll show in a second, but rather to really make sure that energy users are a powerful constituency that is mobilized, that is organized, that is coordinated, and that identifies itself as a constituency. That when we receive bills that are, skyrocketed and on the receiving end of private companies' abuse, that experience isn't a lonely one. It's one that radicalizes, that angers, and that there's a place where that anger can be turned into organizing work and into hope. So, one of the things that they've done with this first image is just to, create public education around electricity. So to break down, topics or concepts that have been, presented as, oh, too technical or out of reach, just into the social media sphere, into, what does average consumption look like in Colombia? What does this mean for price calculations? How are prices calculated? So they do a lot of political education around that. And then they've also done linkages with, for example, here, feminist blocs within the energy users movement. So highlighting how neoliberalism has failed women energy users in particular, and why this is a fight. This is a feminist fight. The public pathway is a feminist fight. And especially in areas like the Caribbean where prices are extremely high, and temperatures are also increasingly high. So what does that mean for, bodies, people that stay at home with no air conditioning, et cetera, in dangerous temperatures? They've also organized around peasants or campesinos in the in the agrarian reform. So what is the connection between energy democracy and agrarian reform? Here, of course, Barranquilla, El Carnaval de Barranquilla is one of the most important sort of carnivals in Colombia. And so why not to create an energy democracy block in the carnival? And in the fight, this one that I'm highlighting here, this is sort of the 1st of May block fighting for social reforms for workers' rights and healthcare. And again, MODEM organized as a block to say energy users are invested in this. And then there's other examples, like in the public housing movement, where, obviously fighting for public housing isn't just having a roof over your head, but it's really also about having public services that guarantee a quality of life in that home. And so I think, I think this is, one of the futures of the energy democracy movement. Administrations like Petro that have given us a lot of hope, unfortunately, will come and go. And it's going to be these movements, not trade unions alone, but movements with trade unions, with energy users, with campesinos, with the feminist movement that sustain the fight for just tariffs. And I think I've gone over time, so I'm going to leave it there for now, and looking forward to my other panelists and questions.
Thanks so much. And yeah, sorry, I know there was obviously so much more to go through there, so hopefully we'll have a bit of time in the questions. But yeah, really pleased to hand over to Lazarus Tamana now for the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people to speak about the worst consequences of the lack of energy sovereignty within a country where Global North Corporation has continued to extract everything they can from a country in the global south. But I'll stop talking and I'll pass over to Laz.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, sounds good.
Right. I'm delighted to be in your midst this evening. My name is Lazarus Tamana, the president of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people. Our movement was formed in 1990. Basically, to hold the oil corporation, oil shell to account because of the level of devastation that we were experiencing in our communities and that. Now, we have been around now for going to 35 years now. And what we initially started has not, the solution has not been solved. You talk about right to energy and right to affordable energy. We don't have that at all. There used to be 4 refineries in Nigeria before this time. But currently, even one is not working very well. It is a private one of Dangote that is propelling every single thing in Nigeria, which everyone is just after that, which means the energy usage is extremely very high. Cars and electricity. Some people don't see electricity in their areas for months, close to a year. And that is the current situation in many parts of Nigeria. Yet, Nigeria produces over 2 million barrels of oil a day. And we have what you call natural liquefied gas, which is controlled by Shell majorly and other small companies, which will have been able to give us gas if we cannot get other forms of energy to run our homes. Because when it is extremely very hot, you need air conditioning, you need fan and other things to be able to be comfortable. But we don't have those facilities in terms of energy, affordable energy, to be able to have those things. Even some areas, you don't even have anything to charge your phones. And that's the reality in a country that is producing so much oil. And this, we attribute it to so many things: the lack of authority from government and the intransigence of the multinational companies that are actually producing this oil. Their target is exports. And that has played a negative game on the entire population in Nigeria. Now, if you look at what is currently going on, there is no way ordinary people can hold these people to account, apart from some companies, some organizations that are campaigning for all these things, but that is not enough. The authority and direction will have come from the government to lay out the foundation for this energy usage so that the multinational companies will have followed and do what is necessary. But in our own case, this has not happened. So communities like the Ogoni people, the people of the Niger Delta, because of pollution, because of devastation, who don't want these companies to be around, are now fighting with these companies to make sure that something meaningful is done. We drove Shell away from our from Ogoni land in 1993 because they have not met what we wanted. The rent were not paid to the local people, they paid it to government, and the facilities that we needed to be comfortable, services for the schools, the hospitals, and other amenities that we need in Ogoni is absent. And as a result of that, we are looking for who was supposed to provide that. If the government is not providing that, and the oil companies that are extracting mineral from our area that are not allowing us to live a comfortable life, then we decided that no, enough was enough. Unless there is new ideas that they come up with, we must have to sit and agree on terms and conditions. Since 1993, we have not allowed Shell into Ogoni land, and they have been looking for ways to enter Ogoni and continue to mine oil and extract gas because we have good reserves that are there. And these are the things that we have been fighting. And they are now trying to use the government of the day, the government, to force their way into the region and to do things that are not allowed by our people. And we are resisting these things and that. Unless the communities, unless indigenous people, unless minorities stand up for their rights in those countries, these things will not happen. In Nigeria in particular, the major tribes are not sitting on these minerals. So they don't feel what we, the minorities and the indigenous people, are feeling about this devastation and about how this thing is affecting our lives. So the money gets to Abuja, then they start to share it. Sometimes they forget about the source where these minerals come from. They forget about the devastation that we are facing, which is a major, major difficulty for all of us. Now, in those local areas, you don't have companies that are operating, that will have like trade unions that can fight for them. They don't have organized labor that can do that. In fact, the strength of organized labor in Nigeria is drastically reduced because all of them turn out to be politicians, not labor union anymore. If you do anything, they intimidate you and you don't have any voice whatsoever. So we are operating from an area where there are multiple difficulties to be able to confront these oil companies and the government for them to provide the services that are needed for energy, for other amenities that can make the people extremely very comfortable. So it is extremely difficult. Most of these countries we are talking about, like in South America, in Colombia, as examples were given, they have organized labor, they have trade unions that are fighting, and indigenous people are well organized. But in our own case, it's just not like that, And these are the things that has made the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people and other small, small organizations in the Niger Delta to be committed to hold these companies to account. Currently, we are in court about a case of border people where they won Shell in 2014 and Shell has refused to clean the environment, which was the agreement made in court. After payment, after compensation, they were to clean, then remediate, then restore the environment. This has not happened. The government is not particularly worried about it. If we don't take on these corporations, nobody is going to do it. That's why we brought it to London here, so that the court here can decide for us, so that these companies can be held to account. We are not finding it easy in Nigeria. If it was that easy there, we would have been able to implement that or push it in that region. The structure of the environment is just not conducive for such a thing. So it's not only energy that not only energy areas that we are suffering. We are suffering in so many different areas that is something that we are extremely worried about it. I mean, I'm in touch with them all the time, and the situation is extremely very bad. Even the food security is patchy. The areas that in Ogoni where they would have been planting, where they would have been going to fishing, because of pollution, they couldn't do that. And there is no government support which will help the people. So it is absent, completely absent. And that is a major problem. There are times that I ask myself, what are we benefiting from the mass the gas that we have and the oil that we have in abundance. Because if you go to Ogoni today, you cannot see any presence of company like Shell in terms of development. Everything is just basic. We don't have clean drinking water at the national or state level. You need to build your own and construct your own borehole. If not, there is no water to drink. The schools are not that equipped. Most of the schools are now private schools. And that in Ogoniland, the major hospital, which was supposed to be sponsored by the government, is just not, there are no amenities in there. So you are on your own if you are sick. If you get to anywhere that there is hospital, which is going to be private hospital, they are extremely very expensive and very high. So we are looking at this thing. What is the benefit of oil extraction? What is the benefit of the oil and the gas, which is the energy, to the people? In terms of the Niger Delta people and the Ogoni people, there are no benefits. Not much benefit has been noticed up to now. So it is a major concern for my people. Statistics have shown that since they came to the Niger Delta area in 1956, 1958, the Niger Delta has been deteriorating because as farmers, subsistence farmers or fishermen, we depended on the land. But when the land has been polluted and the rivers has been polluted, there is no other source where we can turn to for our source of living. Shell doesn't employ a lot of people in the Niger Delta. Although the government do employ people in some sectors and all that, but that is not enough compared to the population. So there are gaps all over, which is creating a lot of problems in terms of lack of what we needed to do, what will have benefited us, what our people should be focusing on in terms of survival that are absent. So we are now being extremely very careful, and we are telling the government we need to sit down and look at the benefits of the oil that has to go to our people. If not, we are not ready for any oil extraction in the region because it is of no benefit. Close to 70 years, we have been suffering this, and it is high time we stand up and made sure that these issues are resolved either amicably or one way or the other. This is the only way we can go forward. I know for sure that the cases that we have in London right now, the Bodo case, the Ogale case, the Bile case, are cases that we have all the evidence that are available for us, which we are going to win. But what about other communities who don't have such financial muscle to bring their case to London? What will they do? They need to be also protected one way or the other. And the government will have been the source where these things will have been done, but we are not seeing that. So we are taking the bull by the horn to do these things for ourselves. If not, it will not happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much there, Laz. And obviously, incredibly devastating to hear the impacts of corporations like Shell and their destruction for, like you say, 50, 60, 70 years now across the Niger Delta. And Shell obviously headquartered and housed here in the UK. And I think it's why it's so important that the UK is a leader when we talk about a transition, a fair transition into clean and affordable energy. And with that, and no need me feet to put you last, but I'll pass over now to Chris Hayes from Commonwealth to speak a bit about the campaign for energy democracy here in the UK. So thanks, Chris.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I trust that everyone can hear me. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for putting this on as well. My name's Chris Hayes. I'm the chief economist from Commonwealth, which is a think tank focused on public and democratic ownership. I've just got some slides to share that hopefully everyone can see now. Yeah, at Commonwealth, one of the our guiding principles is the recognition that the energy transition is it's a monumental transformation and a hugely challenging one, and it's one in which there is a huge risk of divergence and conflicts of interests between workers, consumers, the climate, and global justice as well. And one thing that we're always keen to communicate is that public ownership and public coordination is really the only way to thread this needle and to reconcile those interests. And we're keen to warn that a transition led by private capital really only has two routes to go down. Either it's likely to enrich private capital or indeed private equity off the backs of workers and consumers in the global south, or, and I think the more likely one is that it will just unravel and fall apart on its own and do a lot of damage along the way. So that's a large that's a large summary of our thinking around energy. I'm going to talk about GB Energy, which is the new publicly owned energy company in the UK that we were sort of pivotal in the initial ideation of before it was eventually adopted as a policy by the Labour Party. Although, and we're now mainly concerned with trying to make sure that the Labour government delivers on the full potential of that policy and really gives it the ambition that it needs in order to succeed, rather than fall prey to a lot of the obstacles as a result of a failure to fully expand public ownership and control of the energy system, which is what we need in order for it not to fall apart. And we want to emphasize the risks that still are very much present and might lead to GB Energy becoming a failure and then eventually being canned. Just to be clear, that the GB Energy, as was explained in the announcement and in the King's speech background notes, is a new publicly owned energy company that energy production which will own, manage, and operate clean power projects up and down the country. So, contrary to our worst fears, it is not purely a de-risking vehicle. Although, there is an emphasis on ownership and operation, but there's still a need to make sure that that aspect of it is delivered upon. It's also a very popular policy. It was during the 2024 election, it was the second most popular manifesto pledge in the Labour Party manifesto, after the pledge to prevent 16-year-olds from drinking caffeine. But it's still, among the major ones, it's popular precisely because people expect it not to simply sell energy, but to produce and to develop energy generation assets and to deliver it and operate it. And because they expect largely that the promise of bills reduction should be delivered. One of the impetus for the policy in the first place was that it was announced in September of 2022 during the peak of a cost of living crisis, in which not only was there a massive shock to gas prices, but that was then sort of copied and pasted onto electricity prices, precipitating a huge energy-wide crisis. And the messaging that the Labour Party was really keen to lean into was the idea that clean energy, because it can be delivered at a much lower cost, is essential to bringing bills down, and to providing energy security in the face of geopolitical shocks like the war on Russia and reliance on the war in Ukraine, and reliance on Russian gas. However, there is a lot of confusion still about what the actual motivations for that would be, and also what the plan ought to be to actually translate that low-cost clean energy into lower bills. The assumption seems to be at the moment that if you just accelerate the build-out of low-cost wind and solar, that eventually this will push gas out of the mix, and therefore, gas will be a thing of the past, and we won't have to worry about it leading to electricity price spikes anymore. But obviously, there's a very little chance of that particular part of it being delivered within the 5-year window, but that is relevant to the political cycle. Those kind of benefits are not likely to materialize until 10 years or so. What's really needed, much more than that, is a more holistic approach, not just to the development of energy, but also to making sure that the operation of that system is governed according to social need and is not coordinated by the price mechanism, which means that you end up having these extraordinary windfalls, either because the price of gas has gone up or because there's been a low wind, low sun event, such that you have to call upon people to plug the gap, who then suddenly have like huge bargaining power over you. So that's why what the principles that we emphasize, the advantages that we emphasize when talking about public energy, is something that we call the 3 C's. So there's cost, coherence, and certainty. Cost, I mean, is pretty simple. The clean renewable energy is extraordinarily capital intensive, which means it's very sensitive to the cost of capital, to borrowing costs, stuff like that. Now, the government is able to borrow much more cheaply than the private sector. And the spread in the UK between public and private is about 2 percentage points. Now, in terms of your overall electricity price in the end, that means the cost of generating wind or solar electricity goes up by 20% as a result of relying on the private sector to deliver that, rather than just using the government rate of borrowing. So this is like hugely important for energy consumers. Coherence, we talk about the fact that a clean energy system is also extremely complex. It's far more than just a sum of its parts, and there is quite complex interactions between those parts. But if you're just relying on like market transactions to make sure that all of those parts interact together in a way that serves the public interest, then it's inevitably going to get bogged down in these sort of distributional squabbles within the system. And having, using the ability of public planning, you can actually make sure that the system is operated according to social need and is also built out according to social need, rather than private profit at the project level. And finally, certainty is just something that all investors don't part with their capital unless they are certain that it will be worth it. And that's the sort of thing that's given rise to this de-risking phenomenon that Lala was talking about. But of course, the whole point of the transition is that the state already knows it's deploying these policies because it already recognizes with certainty that we need these technologies. So the state is able to overcome those investment hurdles and prevent the whole development pipeline from falling apart, as we've seen with many of the private examples in recent years. We're running a little bit low on time, but I think just to highlight some of the risks that continue in the limited form that GB Energy currently has, because it only has so firstly there's the problem whereby because GB Energy will only be a small part of the generation mix and is not, as far as we're aware, acquiring existing assets. We still have private operators in various parts of the system continuing to exploit system loopholes for private profit. So, for example, every time the grid needs to balance because there's not enough grid capacity or not enough sun or wind. These, as I suggested, the plants that we draw upon to plug those gaps suddenly are in a position to extract huge rents from the system. We've seen this on multiple occasions where they charge exorbitant prices. There's also constant under maintenance and underinvestment by like the transmission and distribution networks. We've seen in many different ways in which wind farms tend to cheat the system, whether it's the curtailment system or the contracts for different system. I saw some people in the comments were referring to Drax, who run a lot of the biomass plants. There's many instances in which those plants have also cheated the system to avoid having to give back to the public and in order to cash in on windfalls. During the midst of the crisis, I should point out, we also have a system that the privately led development system also means that supply chain companies and workers are getting squeezed by developers who are trying to minimize cost in order to squeeze out some profit. Even in the face of all of this, because the global environment is turbulent, a lot of these projects still end up getting cancelled or otherwise renegotiated, which creates a huge number of problems down the line. And we still have this ideological timidity on the part of the government, where they don't want to crowd out private developers because they think they're already doing an okay job. So if I had to, list the obstacles going forward, it's that there is a confusion over purpose, whether we're aiming to create jobs, to bring down bills, to develop at pace and at scale. There's still a lack of strategy over how to achieve those all at once. There's confusion over how bills will be brought down in particular because they're still reluctant to tamper with the pricing system that is completely outdated and which has led to enormous windfalls over the last basically since 2021. Another obstacle is the continued fiscal orthodoxy that is just reluctant to spend even when it means producing assets. So that means that the new fiscal rule that the government has introduced it still privileges small de-risking interventions over full ownership, which add to the debt even if they're producing assets on the other side of the balance sheet. And this tiny 8 billion capitalization means that the eventual portfolio of generation assets is going to be undiversified and, judging by the technologies that they're choosing, highly risky, which means when it comes to evaluating the success 5 years down the line at the ballot box, there's a very high risk of failure. And finally, there's the policymakers are still beholden to private sector, to a form of thinking that privileges the private sector. So the belief that the private sector is more efficient, that it's already delivering more or less to an adequate standard, that it mustn't be crowded out or investors frightened away, or similarly that all you need is to just de-risk the investment opportunities to render it profitable, and then everything will sort itself out from there. Experience has proved that none of those are true. I'll stop there in the interest of time. But thank you so much for listening. I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chris, there. And there's a lot there to take in. And I think we'll send in information after as well, because Great British Energy is something that's new to, I think, all of us here, in regards to what it actually could mean or what it couldn't mean. And we'll send out information sort of towards the end of the week with links from everybody who's been speaking here today, so we can delve further into it. But for now, we do have about 15 minutes left, so we'll invite some speakers back in to sort of close off the session as we wrap up. And there's been some really good questions in the Q&A, and some have been answered already. The last one just there around COP30, which I do think I'd implore all to read. But I'm gonna retailor that question actually and present it back to Lala first, which was around how could we use COP30 Brazil to push for meaningful action on all these issues. And I guess with Brazil happening in Latin America this year, does it provide opportunities for movements in the region to be able to push for more solutions that we've been fighting for and campaigning for, or do you see it as more of the same? How do you see this COP and the opportunities that present there?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, it's both. We live under capitalism. We live in a system full of contradictions. I can completely sympathize with people who are done with the cops and want to boycott them, and solidarity with them and the alternatives they're building. TUED and some other allies will be at COP30, and we're hoping to once again, contest the space. We think COP30 will be the social movement COP, and that there is a political opening under Lula, with Boric, with Petro. There's a political opening for this COP to be more open to bold political ideas. But also it's fundamentally a space to meet across movements. And I'll just briefly say what we're doing. Also following the leadership of War on Want. So we're hoping to put together a delegation of trade unions under the banner of Public Pathway at the COP, or Public Pathway for a Just Transition. And, a lot of times the trade union delegation, which is officially sort of led by the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, is a delegation with badges that is extremely small. And so for different reasons, a lot of times workers are expected to only speak about labor issues. And we know that that's just not the political mandate that trade unions have. Like, we will not be limited to speaking just about worker issues. We're fighting on a dying planet. We're fighting for justice far beyond workers' rights as narrowly understood. And so, I think everything from how to do green industrialization, how to go from an extractive-based model to one of, production that sustains dignified livelihoods, that, in a formalized economy. Of course, Latin America's economy, like much of the global South, is 60 to 80%, depending on the country, informal. So how can we use this opportunity of the just transition to really transform the labor sector for all, not just for the sliver of formalized union workers? How can we position the global energy embargo for Palestine in this agenda, fight for just tariffs, think about a decarbonization that, in Latin America, has a lot more to do with the transport sector and land use and deforestation. That's where the majority of our emissions come from, than from energy use. And so, that has to then deal with agrarian reform. It has to deal with land protection. And these are all trade union issues. These are issues that workers are fighting about and care about. And so this delegation at COP30 wants to position that. And we're working closely with our allies and comrades in CUT, Brazil, the largest national worker center in Brazil. But we're hoping to have a strong Latin America delegation and basically, infiltrate, as many spaces as we can. So we know that the country pavilions, we've already confirmed with Brazil and Colombia, where we'll be holding panels on a public pathway. But we also, want to have spaces for discussion and building, both inside the formal COP space and outside, I think spaces that we have considered less radical, less political. And we are basically saying we're not going to cede that ground. We're going to take this discussion. We're going to take our protests and our proposals to these spaces, including, for example, the International Labor Organization pavilion, which we're trying to have spaces at. And then the last thing I'll say is that, around the COPs, it's as much or more about what you do before and what you do after than what you do during those 2 weeks. And I think, War on Want is just such a great example, a really putting movements in touch with one another, multiplying our efforts, so that we're not just fighting this alone. We're literally in this together.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And that's a really good point to end on, is that we are literally all in this together. And, I like the phrasing of the social movements COP. And I think, this last year or so of campaigning has shown it has to be about social movements in general, building power and coming together and building that movement of movements and building genuine solidarity between movements and between borders. And I think, one of the part of building genuine solidarity is the awareness of each other's struggles and, the key moments in each other's struggles as well. And I guess with that, I'm going to bring Laz back in for a couple of minutes and just ask, you mentioned briefly the court cases that have happened, recently. But do you maybe want to spend 2 or 3 minutes to explain the court cases that have happened in the Bodo, Agale, and Bile communities here in London, and what they mean and what they're fighting for?
Well, the Ogale, Bile, and then the Bodo cases. The Bodo case, they won in court here in London in 2014, and Shell was supposed to have done 4 things which they haven't completed. They were to pay compensation, which they reluctantly paid that. They were to clean up, which for 5 years they haven't done anything. They have not remediated the environment and they have not restored it. So that was why the community has to come back to London, to the court, to hold them to account. Because Shell were on the coast of Bodo messing around for 5 years. And we discovered after a series of tests that out of the 600,000 barrels that were spilled, is only 7% of that has been cleaned. So we brought them here to hold them to account. We have almost concluded all arguments. Just 2 more days for closing remarks on both sides, and then we go and wait for the verdict. That is on the Bodo case. On the Ogale and the Bile case, we started that in February and ended in March, and we are now waiting for the outcome of that. They said it was going to take 3 to 4 months to get the verdict. We are hoping it will be sometimes in July. Then when we get the verdict, I'm sure we will be victorious, and then we take it from there. Shell has been adamant about paying compensation. All the evidence are against them, but they continue to take us from court to court. This is something the Ogale and Bile case started in 2015. We are talking of almost 10 years ago, and we are still on it. They took us through so many hurdles, and finally we are at this point. So so many other communities want to bring their cases here, but we are having difficulties because the law firms are even also afraid of Shell, and the communities don't have money to, spend as lead terms and conditions are favorable. That's why they have been able to handle what they are handling so far. But we needed more lawyers, more law firms to handle other cases in the Niger Delta that are ready to bring them to the UK, but we are finding it extremely very difficult. So that is where we are with those cases.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laz. And we'll send around links to find out more about those the cases, the hearings that are coming up and how you can get involved. We've been involved in joining demonstrations outside the Royal Courts of Justice in Shell headquarters over the last year, and there'll be more upcoming. So yeah, we'll make sure to send them out. We don't have much time left, but that just made me think around the difficulties for communities to hold major corporations to account, particularly in countries in the global south. And Ahmed, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, but you mentioned briefly earlier about ISDS and what that means for communities trying, or even states trying to fight back against corporations and the damage of extraction. So yeah, you have 2 minutes. Do you want to explain a bit of what ISDS is and how that stops communities taking action?
Absolutely. So like I mentioned, ISDS is it's written into trade and investment agreements that countries sign between each other. And what it does, it allows these foreign corporations to sue the governments in courts outside of the domestic legal systems of those countries, right? So it gives them a special legal channel to basically claim that they've been treated badly for whatever reason. And so the case that is obviously relevant today with Glencore is around a coal mine that the company operated in a very impoverished indigenous majority region of the country. And there's been decades of bad treatment from the company, displacement of indigenous people. They've deviated a local river that is very important to the indigenous community there. And the community didn't take this lying down. They fought back and they actually won a ruling in the Supreme Court that limited, even in a very small way, the operations of the company, right? The expansion of the coal mine. And Glencore, because of the ISDS mechanism that was included in the agreement between the UK and Colombia, took Colombia to court, and they've won. They've done this with several cases. They've won millions of dollars as a result. And what this has led to is basically a chilling effect where the Colombian government is worried about taking action that might limit the operations of foreign multinationals because they know that they may be liable to these cases that they will then lose, and who pays the money comes out of the public budget. And so what we've been fighting for with War on One in partnership with organizations in Colombia and the UK as well is for an end to this ISDS rule in the existing treaty that Colombia signed with the UK. And the current Colombia government has been very sort of adamant that they want to reform and potentially withdraw from the system. And as of now, the government is, what we've heard from them is that they're putting the UK on notice that they want to do something about this ISDS. The UK government has already withdrawn from the treaty that is potentially the biggest ISDS treaty called the Energy Charter Treaty that happened last year. And the UK government there was citing that if we are part of this system, if we take steps to implement a transition, such as denying an oil license or whatever other policy, we ourselves may be taken to these international courts, where the UK will then have to pay out of the public budget into the pockets of corporations. So the UK has identified that it's a threat to the UK, and now the next step is to say, well, actually, the biggest victims of the system are countries in the global south, like Colombia, like Nigeria, that face these disputes on a yearly basis. And we have some positive steps there. And so, I guess we'd say keep a watch on the space, keep a watch on War on One communications, because this is something that is really positive and maybe a victory that we can say is really going to open up the way for a just transition.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ahmed. And again, I know there's so much to get into there, so we'll send further reading as well. And just very quickly, I'm going to pass to Seb, who's got a couple of ways you can engage further in this subject, and then we absolutely do need to wrap up. The sun's still shining, and we can let you have a little bit of that sunny evening. So over to you, Seb.
Thanks so much, Ty and friends, for your interventions, your analysis, and kind of painted this really complete global picture of the struggles ahead. I was just thinking about the Glencore action that we were at today, and thinking about how the movement for Palestinian liberation, the climate justice movement, the anti-war movement more broadly, the anti-extractives movement, and those who stand in solidarity with mining affected communities came together today so powerfully. And I feel like Palestine has brought us together out of necessity, because as Petro said in a COP28 a couple of years ago, Gaza is the rehearsal for the future, and he couldn't be more right. So right, this is what's at stake. So I just wanted to share an event that's happening this Saturday quite early at 10 a.m. So if anyone wants to get up early and listen more about the ways in which communities in this region of La Guajira are fighting back, are thinking about a mine closure plan, are thinking about preparations for communities as part of the just transition. Please do join us on Saturday. And also, we have attempted to bring the interventions here in some way into an article that we'll be sharing as well as part of the post-webinar sort of package of things we'll be sharing. And it's been really insightful to have this conversation here to see where the gaps are in terms of that broadening out the analysis. But hopefully it's a useful piece as a starting point to bring some of these arguments together. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm not going to have time to pass around to everyone else for a closing thing. So just going to say thank you so much to every speaker here, Seb, Ahmed, Laz, Chris, and Lala. And yeah, please do check your emails. We'll send around further information on how to engage. In 1 month, we'll have our next Visions webinar. We spoke a little bit about how, billionaires and super wealthy are very much in control of these systems. And we will be delving much deeper into that in how we fix this rigged global economy during the next session in 1 month's time. Which on the last Tuesday of the month, or the fourth Tuesday of the month, instead of Wednesday, because I will be going to Glastonbury to give a talk there. Maybe we'll record that one and share that too. So I'm going to close. Hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you so much for joining, speakers, panelists, and everyone in the audience, and catch you next time. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.